Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to Chattering with Nicholas Vince, the 100th edition of Chattering with Nicholas Vince, which, as I've mentioned before, we're dedicating to a tribute to George Romero, and I'm totally delighted that my friend and George's friend, Chris Rowe, is going to be joining me to talk about George. Chris, hi.
Well, good afternoon.
Hello, mate. So thank you so much for coming, for joining us. You worked with George for what, 15 years? Is that right?
Yeah, I was George's manager for 15 years, and it was really 15 beautiful years, I have to say. In Hollywood terms, that's a lifetime. That's an eternity.
Yeah.
And it was a beautiful friendship, both personally and professionally.
Right, right. How did you meet George?
It's a fun story. I was in Pittsburgh and was introduced to George through Laurie Cardill, and Laurie was the lead in George's third zombie film, Day of the Dead. And at the time, Laurie was a client, and she said to me, she said, "I think George could really use your help. I think he'll like you. You're not like the traditional Hollywood type," which he didn't like. And I remember a meeting was set up, and I remember on the way over to meet with George a couple days later, I remembered I was nervous. I was very, very nervous. And Laurie said to me, she said, "Chris," she goes, "he's more nervous about meeting you than you should be about meeting him." So she said, "Don't worry about it." And I'll never forget, we pulled up in front of this beautiful old Victorian home, massive. And I remember walking up the steps, and his wife at the time answered the door and introduced myself to her and came in, and I sat myself in his den office, and I heard the creaking of steps, and it was just like, creak, creak, and you could hear the steps. And George was tall. He was 6'4", almost 6'5". And so I see feet, and then I see up to the knees, and then higher, and then he had to duck down to come into the room because he was so tall. And he said, "Hi, I'm George Romero." And at that moment, I thought I was gonna honestly pass out, because here was this giant, truly a giant. I had no clue that he was almost 6'5". And we had the most fantastic afternoon, laughing, talking. He had a little chihuahua named Tony, which was running all over the place at the time. And there was a ferret. He had a pet ferret, and that ferret was running all over the place. But it was one of those afternoons that you don't forget. And we bonded, and we clicked. We clicked very well. And then the rest, as they say, is history. 15 years.
Wow, wow. Now, you made obviously, and no doubt we'll get some stories. Incidentally, I would just remind people, if you do want to share a story of having met with George Romero, do please put it in the comments. I've got a couple to read out from Johnny Hughes and Kim Lehman, which I'll do later on. But if you do have any stories you do want to say, I think Johnny Gore has just said, met George 3 times, just meant an awful lot to him. You're saying, you worked with him for 15 years. You made a documentary called One for the Fire, The Legacy of the Night of the Living Dead. How did that come about?
Well, the 40th anniversary was approaching quickly, and George was shooting Diary of the Dead, and we wanted, myself and the partner that I had at the time on that project, we just felt like there had never been anything really done well on the making of Night of the Living Dead, and you'd always heard stories, and you'd always heard, you know, a separate interview with Russ and a different interview with George. And so we really spent a lot of time just talking to George about who do we really talk to, and Russ and a lot of the key players. And I remember I got George's blessing for that, and it meant the world to me that he gave me the blessing to do that, which kind of meant carte blanche, you know, so to speak, to kind of do what I wanted to do. And so we did. We shot that in 2007, most of 2007. We went to Pittsburgh, did I think 3 or 4 days of filming there. We filmed actually all at Los Angeles, and then we went to I remember we went to Denver, interviewed Alice Cooper there. We interviewed people from all over the place, and it ended up being released by the Weinsteins for the official 40th anniversary at the same time that Diary of the Dead came out. So it ended up kind of piggybacking onto the release of Diary of the Dead, and it was a nice remastered print that they released of Night, and it was very well received. It won a Rondo Award for Best DVD Feature, and it was a great experience. I got to not only go to all the important places where Night of the Living Dead was shot, and kind of once you were there, you went, oh my God, it looks the same. Like, you know, the basement. The basement was actually shot in the office building that they had. It wasn't actually in the house.
Right.
And you walk down the steps and you go, oh my God, that's it. It literally, you know, parts of it completely look the same. But the house, the farmhouse, is no longer there. But the cemetery, for anyone who saw it, we kind of recreated the whole opening scene, going down the very roads and the exact turns that the car made with Russ, Striner, and Judy O'Day in the beginning of the movie. And so it got released. I remember, I think one of the real highlights of that was getting to screen it in Spain at Sitges Cinema Fantastique Film Festival there, which was a great honor to do that. And it was a beautiful experience. And I can't say it brought me closer to George, because we were already really close, but it was fun just to sit down and hear his side of the story on how it really happened, because it changes over the years. You know, people's stories change, and suddenly it's like, oh no, he didn't do that, he did this. And it was great to kind of hear it from his mouth and Russ Striner's mouth, and the real key people. And it was really, really great. And it's been available for the last 10 years on DVD. And now the 50th anniversary hits next year.
I was going to say, yeah, by those maths.
Yeah, the 50th hits next year. But the brilliant thing about the 50th anniversary is that, and unfortunately, George isn't going to get, you know, didn't get to see the release of it, but he got to see the remastered film that he worked hard on for the remastering process. Criterion, the deal was just signed with Criterion not too long ago, and they're going to release Night of the Living Dead in an absolutely brilliant 4K restoration. It is so beautiful, and it is so crisp, and all the pops and cracks and all of that is gone, and the color, the black and white, has been enhanced, and it's just brilliant. George got to see it at MoMA in New York City in early November of last year for the premiere of it. It was a beautiful evening, and so the 50th is here, and I know Criterion, they're going to be doing some featurette things for it, for the release, and I also hear they're going to put it back in movie theaters in October, is what it sounded. So I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, yeah. Do you remember the first of George's films that you personally saw? And obviously you'd have seen them before you met George. Can you go that far back?
I do. It's an absolutely hilarious story, which I actually shared at his funeral ceremony uh, a week ago, and it was probably 1986, and I was from Iowa originally, and anyone from Iowa or that part of the Midwest knows there's a pretty good likelihood it's going to rain or snow on Halloween. And my mother, I think I was 13 at the time, my mother felt badly that the whole evening's festivities were ruined because of the weather. My mom loved horror films, so she said, look, I'm going to go out, I'm going to rent some videos, this is VHS, and I'll come back. And she did. She came back and she had rented 3 films. Not one of them I had heard of. She got some snacks and candy and food, and we just sat down and we had this great evening. And the first film that she put in after we ate was Day of the Dead. I picked it out. It looked interesting. There was this picture of this, a very, very wrinkled up zombie, later to become Bub. I would know him as Bub. And we watched that movie. And as much as my mother loved horror films, my mother had a very weak stomach. And anyone who's seen Day of the Dead, it's the most gruesome and gory, I think, of George's films. And what I remember most about that movie is not the movie itself, but my mother about every 15 minutes running to the bathroom gagging because, the carnage that takes place in that movie is unbelievable. And it's Tom Savini's shining hour as far as I think effects. And I remembered being kind of in awe over not only my mom gagging, but those effects and how real it looked. And it was the first time I had ever heard the name George Romero. And it was the first time I had ever heard the name Tom Savini, because I had to find out who this director was and who this special effects makeup artist was. And then that's how I discovered his other films, George's, and then discovered that Tom Savini had worked for him in other films, not only as effects, but also an actor. So little did I know, fast forward 16 years, that I would be sitting in the office of the man who created that film. And I remember telling George that story. And I remember him I remember laughing. He laughed and laughed. But that was my first George Romero movie that I remember watching. And so it's bitter, it's bittersweet, because it's sweet because of those memories. My mother passed away quite some time ago in 1999, so she never got to know that I met George, but she knew how mesmerized I was with his films. Mm-hmm. Not her cup of tea. Night of the Living Dead she thought was great. Day of the Dead was tolerable. Or Dawn of the Dead was tolerable. Day of the Dead, she just couldn't handle it. But it was a beautiful night, not only for my mom and I, because we had this great evening together until she got sick, but I still like that. But then I discovered George. And so again, my only regret is I wish that she would have got to know that I not only got to meet him, but we would have a 15-year relationship together.
Right. Actually, not that. This is Jonathan Hughes sent in one of a story. He said, my mum was dating a guy who was a bit of an arsehole. So one night I suggested we watch Dawn of the Dead during dinner. When it got to the part where the zombies started eating the insides of people, my mum's boyfriend at the time threw up his dinner. It was hysterical. Thank you for that, Jonathan. Yes, I was actually watching. Because obviously I was watching as many of his films in preparing for this, and I'm pretty certain I'd seen all 3 of them before, but it's such a long time ago. And I was just watching Day of the Dead this morning. And you're right. I mean, it's Tom Savini's. They're so much better than, for example, his really early work, which was on Martin, of course. And in fact, Tom Savini will say, it was terrible because they just used stage blood, because there wasn't really a film blood at the time, and they just used what they used to use on stage. It looks like melted crayons. But so that was the first time you saw George Romero. What's your favorite George Romero movie? If I had to say, okay, you can only take one to your desert island with you, which one would you take?
That's very complicated. So I'm going to tell you that I get to take three,
okay,
not one,
right.
because I really don't know. There's probably four that I really truly enjoy,
mm-hmm.
and two of them are a bit more. They've caught on as the years have gone by, and that's Monkey Shines. I thought Monkey Shines was a fantastic film, and I thought it was creepy and scary, and what a fantastic cast of people. So Monkey Shines definitely is one. The Dark Half, which was based off of a Stephen King book, it starred Timothy Hutton and Amy Madigan, Michael Rooker. Again, that movie kind of went under the radar. It went under the radar because Orion, which was supposed to be the indie filmmakers' studio to go to, they were going bankrupt at the time. And so they just didn't have the money to put into the publicity for that film. Two Stephen King's films came out at the exact same time, just a few weeks apart. Needful Things, which starred Ed Harris, Amy Madigan's husband, Max von Sydow, came out about 3 or 4 weeks before The Dark Half did. And MGM, who released that, I mean, they just, they had the money. They had the money to put into the press and PR, and that movie did well. The Dark Half, it didn't do as well, and I think it's probably the one film of George's that should have done gangbusters. It was intense. It was suspenseful. It had the teaming up of Stephen King and George. Stephen loved the screenplay that George wrote for it. So it didn't do as well. And again, I think that had to do with Orion. They were going bankrupt at the time. And then if I had to pick one of the dead, I would say Night of the Living Dead and Day of the Dead are my two favorite Dead films. And then I have to stick in Creepshow. So I have to take 5 with it. I'm sorry. It really depending upon what kind of mood I'm in, depends upon which movie I want to watch. But I don't think people realize sometimes the star power that George worked with in his films. George and I were dining for my birthday in London at the Ivy.
Right.
You and I know that well.
Yes.
And we were having a beautiful evening. It was George, his wife, and I. And George was facing me. His wife was to my right. And he said to me, Chris, is that Stanley Tucci behind you? And I said, well, I don't know. Yeah, that's Stanley. And if you know the Ivy, you never know who's going to be in there that's an A-lister. And I said, yeah. Well, of course, Stanley Tucci, many don't know this, George directed Stanley Tucci in the Monkey Shines.
Yeah.
And George was like, should I go over and say something? I said, absolutely you should. He goes, nah, I don't want to bother him. I said, George, you have to. You haven't seen Stanley in 30 years. You got to go do this. So he did. And Stanley immediately jumped up and grabbed him and gave him a hug and shook his hand, introduced him to his wife. And I could hear all this behind me. George came back 4 or 5 minutes later. And he said, God, I'm really glad that you told me to do that. Well, before Stanley left, Stanley got up, came over to our table, and Stanley introduced himself to me and to George's wife. And he said, I hope you realize how lucky you are and what kind of an amazing client you have. George Romero is a wonderful person. And so there's this long list of A-listers that George has worked with through the years. Hal Holbrook and Ed Harris, 2 films. And the list goes on and on. So many people got the opportunity in the very early days to work with George before their careers exploded.
Mm.
And I think when you look at that, when you dissect those films and you look at some of the people who went on to become really big stars, many of them got their first starring role or their first big role in a George Romero movie. And George loved to pick great actors. And I think when you look at the movies that I just mentioned, even though Night of the Living Dead didn't go on to spawn superstars, Day of the Dead didn't go on to spawn superstars, I think there were some great performances there. But when you look at Creepshow, Dark Half, and Monkey Shines, all those movies ended up spawning some huge stars or already big stars at the time. Leslie Nielsen, Adrienne Barbeau was already very well known at the time, and Hal Holbrook, of course. So George did work with some great people.
Yeah. I have to say, one of my favorites is Martin. And I know George has been his own YouTube, and I think when I was talking to his wife, 4 or 5 years ago, he was saying it was one of George's favorites as well. I think
it was his favorite.
Yeah.
Martin was his favorite film that he ever directed was Martin, because it's the movie that he had the most control over. He had the freedom to do whatever he wanted to do, and his favorite Dead film of all the Dead films was Day of the Dead, because of just everything that was going on in his life at the time with his family and professionally and all of that. So, but Martin was definitely his favorite film that he directed and wrote.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, folks, I mean, it really is true indie horror. It's really low budget. And I remember I was watching one of the interviews on the DVD special edition from Arrow, in this case, that I have, and he was just saying that basically probably they ate the best that they'd ever eaten because they were in somebody's grandmother's house, and she just she was cooking them lasagna and pasta and so on, and then he'd had a great time. So you've spoken about meeting Stanley Tucci, and so what's your favorite? Probably because you spent a lot of time with George doing conventions and meeting fans. Do you have a favorite moment from one of the conventions, from him dealing with fans, or a Q&A or anything?
I think it's hard to say a favorite moment. I know that George's favorite convention was Texas Frightmare Weekend in Dallas. Lloyd and Sue Cryer run just a fantastic convention. You've been there,
Yeah.
So it was always kind of like being around family when you were there. It's the same security people. It's the same volunteers. It's the same staff that it's been for 10 years. But 2 years ago, George was there, and Howard Sherman, who played Bub in Day of the Dead, did a day where Tom Savini flew in and did his makeup as Bub.
Wow.
And George and Howard did a photo op together, a special photo op together. And George was just amazed at that. He just was amazed to see Bub come back. A little heavier. He'd been eating a lot of flesh over the last 30 years, but he loved that. He loved how he was able to do that with Howard. And we had some great things planned for the 50th anniversary of Night of the Living Dead next year, and the 40th anniversary of Dawn next year. So we were going to try to do some fun things like that, because for George, it's not that he would get bored, but as you know, with conventions, it's kind of the same routine. And that was different, and that was fun. And it was great fun to be able to do that. And I remember it was the last time he was at Texas. And of course, Lloyd and Sue were bringing him in this next year for the 50th anniversary. But he said, I'm really glad that we did this. I'm really glad this worked out. So there's lots of stories. I mean, I could go on for days. Actually, there is one I will share.
Mm-hmm.
It was in, it's two stories in one. We were at a show called Dragon Con in Atlanta.
Uh-huh.
And George, being George, he would compliment people over everything. Their costumes, their this, or that. Hey, that looks really good. How'd you do that? And this girl walked up to the table, and she'd been waiting in line for a very long time. And George looked at her and he goes, hey, he goes, you look great. How'd you get your teeth to look like that? And she stopped and she looked at him and she said, cigarette and tooth decay. Her teeth were literally rotting out of her mouth, and George meant it as a compliment. He thought that she had, done the whole get up in order to blend in with the other people, and that wasn't the case. And of course he went, I'm sorry. And she was like, oh no, don't be, you just complimented me, and as she's smiling, all of her teeth are rotted out. That sticks out because I just thought it was absolutely hilarious. And probably 15 minutes later, this girl came through the line, and she was dressed like Princess Leia, but Princess Leia from what was it, Return of the Jedi, where she's all kind of sexy and she's got the the little wrap on, and this girl was a little chunky, and she was wearing this and revealing everything above and below. And this girl came up and she was shaking, and I didn't know if she had she was going through an epileptic fit. I didn't know what was going on, but she was just like, and dressed like Princess Leia, and everything was kind of flowing and jiggling. And she got to George and she shook his hand and she's shaking, and she goes, oh my God, would you please autograph my ass? And she turned around and she just kind of like plopped her ass right on the table. And I remember, because I was sitting next to him, I remember George kind of going back like that, and she went back with a marker. And he said, I absolutely will not. And he reached across the table. He grabbed a photo that was close by. He said, what is your name? Whatever her name was. And he signed it, and he goes, that's going to have to work. And that's when he said he was no longer going to sign body parts. He stopped. That's when he stopped. He said, I'm not going there anymore. And so from that point forward, he never signed another body part again, not an arm, a leg. If someone wanted his signature tattooed, they had to bring a piece of paper or something, and he'd sign that. Right. Those are a couple of just fun stories with fans that I are stuck up here.
Right? Yeah, I can imagine. As I say, I met George a couple of times and spoke briefly with him a couple of times. Always very gentle, very sweet. And so on. This is a really tough one to think. What do you think is his lasting legacy? What do you think people will remember him for? But also, more importantly, what do you think people should remember him for?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think he what I feel is he took a stagnant genre, because remember, when Night of the Living Dead came out in '68, the only thing that was really around were the Hammer horror films, which some of those were really silly. You had your Roger Corman films; those were really silly. Vincent Price was kind of like the guy at the time. Yeah. Some of those movies were scary, and some of them weren't. His earlier films, like House of Wax, I thought was really thrilling, and movies like The Tingler and House on Haunted Hill and all of that. But for the most part, the genre had kind of gone stagnant. There was really nothing there. Rosemary's Baby hadn't come out yet. Certainly The Exorcist was another 5 years away from coming out. But so he took a stagnant genre and he brought it back to life with Night of the Living Dead. And so he put life into the dead, and look what became of that. Look, it's very safe to say Walking Dead wouldn't exist if it were not for Night of the Living Dead. The creators of The Walking Dead were directly inspired by George. So I think what he did was he reinvigorated a stagnant genre. And he became an inspiration to young filmmakers everywhere and basically said to them, yes, you can do this. You don't have to have $500,000, $1 million to do this. You can go get a camera and you can do it. You got to work together as a team, because George loved a family environment. So pick a good team of people and go out there and shoot. And right to the very end, he would say to people, look, if you start a movie, finish it. No matter what obstacles you come across, no matter if you run out of money and then have to come back to it later, but finish it. Because no artist should leave a work incomplete. And the people through the years who have been inspired by George Lucas saw George and was just like, you know, this is George Lucas. Spielberg, Guillermo del Toro, Quentin Tarantino, Frank Darabont, Edgar Wright, Robert Rodriguez. The list goes on and on and on. The people who were inspired by George. As filmmakers, they went on to become successful filmmakers themselves. John Landis, John Carpenter. Remember, George was before all of those people. And he basically said, look, this is what you can do with a few bucks. And he did it. So I think his contribution to the world of independent filmmaking is, yes, you can. You can do this. You just got to stick with it. You got to put a little heart into it, but you can do this. His legacy will be not only the inspiration to filmmakers and what he showed to them, but I think also the message in what he talked about in his movies. People often go, oh my God, that was so gory, that was so scary, that was a great kill. Okay, that was all great. But that was one layer to George's films. George always had something to say in his movies. There was always some kind of political or social comment about what was going on. And people sometimes miss that. They don't always see the political message or hear the political message, but when you, like in the Dead films especially, there's a message there. You just have to look. It's talking about us. It's talking about the neighbors. It's talking about the government. If you take a look at a movie like The Crazies, well, that's completely talking about the government and all the shenanigans within the government. So there was always a message. And, you know, one of the things I loved about George is that he never sold out to the system. As his manager, I remember getting offers for hundreds of thousands of dollars for him to put his name to projects. And he wouldn't do it because it was just some cheap kind of schlocky horror film that, you know, was blood and guts and, you know, torture, whatever. And, you know, a lot of other directors of the genre have done that. They'll just take the money and run. And George never did that. I remember him saying to me one day, he said, my movies have always meant something, that there's always been a meaning. And he goes, if I put my name to this, it goes against everything that I believe in. And so, you know, I think his legacy will be around for a long, long time, because his contributions to even young filmmakers today is still the same. And now it's so much easier to make a movie today. I mean, you know, you can make one on your iPhone. I mean, it's like now, back 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, it was a little harder to make a movie. Now, you know, you get these wizards that can just come in and do everything on the computer. You can make a movie. And George, to this, you know, right up until the end, he would talk to these kids and say, do this, hey, do that. So, you know, I think those are his contributions, and it's going to be around for a long, long time because the influence is there. Night of the Living Dead is considered one of the top, last time I read, was one of the top 15 most important independent films ever made.
It's an extraordinary, yeah. I'm not surprised. Yeah.
And you go, well, okay, it may not be your cup of tea, but you have to look at what it did. George, per se, wasn't a horror fan when he made Night of the Living Dead. He wasn't really at all. But when he got together with all those folks who formed Image 10, it was, well, what do we make that's going to make money? And everyone agreed horror at the time made money because they were targeting a young audience. They were targeting teens and, you know, early 20s. And look what it became.
It's extraordinary. Actually, this is a good point to share. Tom, apparently, Esme Rock says Sam Raimi also loved George as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. He did.
Kim Lehman, I love George Romero's films. I grew up watching them. My favorite film of his is Night of the Living Dead. I love the black and white, the grainy look the film had. The music from when the film starts, it just set the mood. I was 11 when I first watched this. I had to beg my father and mother for them to let me watch it. They did. The scene where Karen Cooper lifts the trowel over her head and then kills her mom, that scene always got to me. I loved his characters. All of his film had that. Characters you rooted for, identified with. That's why his films will always stand out to me. And I always loved the scene, they're coming to get you, Barbara. And the blood and the gore was awesome too. And I think that was something I, you know, wanted to think about as well, is the fact it's not, as you say, and he himself acknowledges, they're horror movies, in inverted commas, but there's so much more than that. The craze, as he said, I mean, he acknowledged the fact that he's perhaps a little heavy-handed in having a go at the government, but it is those guys in the white suits and the face masks, these anonymous things who are just entering people's homes and taking stuff and rounding people up, basically in the crazes. But the just the characterization. They're really well-rounded characters. And this is again just coming back to Martin with Tom Savini in Martin, does a really, really good job playing the arsehole boyfriend, basically, who constantly stands up. This is what people, this is the influence. Apart from, you know, the fact that he's an independent filmmaker, do you think there is a George Romero style of filmmaking that you could conceptualize? Is there, you know, it's I think, okay, this is definitely a George Romero movie, because there seem to be, you know, he seemed to cover such a wide range. He did the independent stuff. I mean, obviously, Dark Half is an MGM off the top of my head production. Yeah. You know, it's a much bigger budget.
Yeah. Well, is there a George Romero style? Well, sure. I mean, I think, you know, you could watch a George Romero movie and you could find the style in the writing. You could find the style in his way of shooting. But with George, you always knew it was a George Romero movie, even if you didn't see the titles. Just pay attention to the characters. Pay attention to the social commentary and the political commentary that's happening. George is an example. I was going to say this about Night of the Living Dead. People forget Dwayne Jones was an African-American man, a lead in a movie in 1968. And in this movie, he slaps a white woman. Not exactly a well-received thing at the time for most films. But George didn't pick Dwayne, and the other producers didn't pick Dwayne because he was black. That character was originally kind of an overweight truck driver, white truck driver. Dwayne was just the best guy in the group. George didn't see color when it came to picking. Yeah, he just didn't at all. And George, if you look at most of his films, there was always an African-American important lead in every one of those films. He had one in Night. He had Ken Foray in Dawn. He had in Day, Terry Alexander. If you look at Land of the Dead, you had the Big Daddy character. And he did this throughout other films like Night Riders and so on and so forth. I mean, he was all about giving people great roles regardless of their color or their ethnicity. He loved that. And he, I remember, as I recall with Land of the Dead, one of the leads, he wanted to be African American, and Universal flat out said no. Did not want to do that. They felt that it would not sell internationally. And so what he did was he made Big Daddy African American, which ended up being the mascot of the whole thing. I mean, it's, you know, all the poster art has that character on it. So George got what he wanted without, and the studios were so stupid, they didn't realize that George basically got exactly what he wanted. So he loved to push those buttons, and he loved to make sure that those kinds of things were there in his films. And, you know, he succeeded very well with that. So there was definitely a style to what he did, not only in his writing, but in the actors that he chose, and even in the style of shooting that he did. You know, and the music also. Movie music was very important to George. It was so important. We had many conversations about this through the years, and you know, there's a great scene in Dawn of the Dead when the camera kind of pans down and you just see all this insane carnage happening, and with that music going, it's you know, it's haunting. I think there's a similar scene in Land of the Dead too, which had a fantastic score. So there was this Romero influence on everything. And lastly, let's not forget, George, before he was a filmmaker, was an editor. George knew how to edit, and George would spend 5 months sleeping in the editing bay with his editor, working on a project day in and day out. But the great thing about George was he knew every single person's job on a set. So when someone would come to him and say, well, we need more money for this, or we need more time for that, he would go, no, you don't. Or, okay, I can understand that. He knew every single person's job because he did it all. And while George was shooting, he was editing in his mind how he wanted to show something. So there's so much that, at least when I look at a movie of George's, you go, okay, I get it, I see it. And it's so heavily influenced by him. In today's world, he would be the one-stop shop. He would be the writer, the producer, the director, the editor. I mean, he would be everything, you know, if he were a 25-year-old young filmmaker.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and this is funny enough. Johnny Gore has just reiterated the thing, the fact that George's editing. I mean, in fact, he edited by himself some of his earlier movies. In fact, Martin is written, directed, and edited by George, I believe. Some of the later ones he used another gentleman whose name entirely escapes me just at the moment. What I wanted to is just another quick story from Johnny Gore, saying he met George at Memorabilia in Birmingham on 3 different occasions. He'd met George, and just how kind George was. In terms of influences, well, we talked about how George influenced other people. I was in doing the research of this, I think, and George's wife had mentioned this to me, is that one of the films that he found most influential is Tales of Hoffman. Yeah. Have you seen it?
Yeah, a long time ago I did, and a long time ago. There's a great story about Tales of Hoffman. George grew up in the Bronx, and George would go down to this local camera store and rent a 16mm print of Tales of Hoffman. He had a big white wall, and he would watch it at home on the white wall or the screen that he had, over and over again and over again. But then sometimes he would go there and it wouldn't be in, so he would rent something else. This went on for years, and all the time. So like not like rent it a few times throughout the year. I mean, George was obsessed with this movie, so he would rent it all the time. And sometimes he would go in there and it would be gone. So he asked the guy behind the counter one time, he goes, why is it every time I come in here, this movie is like, it's here or it's gone. There's nobody else in the Bronx that could possibly like this film. Who is renting it? And the guy looked it up, and it was Martin Scorsese. And Martin Scorsese, that was one of his favorite films of all time. And so when Tales of Hoffman, when they did a big kind of remastering, special edition release of it, Martin called George and asked him, you know, would you do some interviews with me about this? But look at those two genius filmmakers, completely different, but yet they were drawn to the same movie. It was so inspirational for them. So yeah, that was a really important film for George. And it was one that really made him want to be a filmmaker, was that movie.
It's fascinating. I have to say, I watched it this week. I have to say, it is not my type of thing at all. This is grand opera. Having said that, it's, oh, God, it goes on forever. But it's, I'm not a big fan of opera, folks. Sorry, I'm just not. I like light opera, comic opera. Really big fan of.
Well, you and I are going to go to Madame Butterfly or Turandot or Carmen next time we're in the same city where that's happening, and I'll take you to some good opera.
Yeah, take me to some good opera.
I'll give you a vodka, and you'll settle down. It'll be good.
And I'll pass out. It is wonderful. I mean, I can understand why, as filmmakers, they love this movie so much, because
the artistry
is absolutely amazing, and apparently shot in a couple of, filmed in a couple of weeks as well. The sets are amazing. The Robert Helpman's eyebrows in Coppelius, he's got eyebrows that are like that long. They literally come out of his head like that.
It's almost like Martin Scorsese's.
Robert Helpman, for those who don't recognize the name, played the child catcher in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and was a ballet dancer originally. It's the artistry of the cinema. I can completely see why. And actually, to be honest, if you watched it with the sound off, you probably get as much out of watching it. In fact, not more, because you can just look at the images.
Yeah, visually, it's beautiful. Yeah.
It really is absolutely stunning. It is an extraordinary. And I think he listed his other favorite films to Rotten Tomatoes.
Repulsion was one of them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, one of George's favorite films. In fact, George said that when people ask George what his scariest film was, it was Repulsion by Roman Polanski.
Right.
George and I had many conversations about this. In fact, we had even started to work on a screenplay about mental illness. He found mental illness to be very frightening. And he found it to be really scary. Now, of course, mental illness 50, 60 years ago was dealt completely differently with then than now. I mean, if you were thought to be mentally ill, you were put in a sanitarium 50, 60 years ago. Now there's different methods that they do, thank God, that's not so barbaric. But George and I, we used to talk about that very often, which was being mentally ill has to be terrifying, not only for the person that's mentally ill and what they go through, but also for the people around them. I mean, look at the different types of mental illness and take a look at what the loved ones and people have to go through. People who have borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, multiple personality. I mean, it's like when you start looking at all of those things and you start looking at how people who are inflicted with these disorders, how they act, and the turmoil and strife that it brings on the family, it's pretty horrifying. I mean, I certainly know firsthand of it from people, and it's sad. It's really sad, living on edge. Look at the horror stories of parents, mothers who are go on a bipolar rampage and drowned all their children in the bathtub or stab them all to death because they hear demons saying that their children are evil, or it's horrifying. So look at the true horror that comes out of something like that. So George often talked about repulsion, and it's for the time, I think it was a pretty scary film. George and I watched it together. That's how I was introduced to it, and I to this day still feel like that film is one of Roman Polanski's best. If you're a Roman Polanski fan, you should definitely check that out.
Right. Okay, it's not one I know at all. So I will indeed. Johnny mentioned also there's The Quiet Man and Thing from Another World, Othello, the Orson Welles Othello. He also chose, as I say, as well as On the Waterfront.
George passed away listening to the music of The Quiet Man.
Yes,
that was playing. He loved movie music. And one of the best times I ever had with George, and there were many, was watching The Cowboys with John Wayne. And George said to me, "You've never seen The Cowboys?" I said, "No, I've never seen The Cowboys." He goes, "Oh my God, you want to watch it right now?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Wait till you hear the film score. Wait till you hear this film score by John Williams." And it started, and you know the old films, how they started with the overture in the beginning?
Yes.
So it starts, and I look over, and George is crying. He's crying. And I look over at him, and the tears are flowing down his face. And the movie hasn't started, just the music has started. And we watched that movie, and I remember looking over, and I don't want to give the movie away, but towards the end of the film, there's this really intense scene. Someone dies, and I look over, and George is crying again. That's the type of person George was. There was this human side to him. You take the artist and the director and the writer, and you put that aside. People don't always get to know about the person and how they were and what touched them and what moved them. And that moment was one of the first moments where I ever saw a side of George I had never seen before. And I'm sitting with George Romero in his living room, and he's crying. And because it had touched him so much. And even though he knew it was happening, he'd seen this movie so many times. It was one of the greatest nights that I can ever remember having with him. And I remember afterwards, he goes, "Let's go get some food." And we walked into the distillery district in Toronto, and he put his arm around me, and we just had this walk. And it was one of the most beautiful evenings that I'll ever have. It's something I've always cherished. And every time I hear the Cowboys, the music, I think of George before he passed and now after. And I actually was reaching out to John Williams before George passed, because I wanted John to sign sheet music for George. I knew it would have meant so much to him, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen in time, but it was one of his very favorite scores. So.
Oh wow, wow! Thank you for sharing that. Now we're coming towards the end of the show.
I thought we were doing 5 hours.
I know we could just do it again later on. We'll put those. We'll take the remaining 4 hours, and the next time you and I meet up, you could. Sorry.
At the Ivy or Bob Ricard's in London, right?
Yeah, at the Ivy or Bob Ricard's. Sorry, all I've heard from downstairs is Craig going, "Hell no." As I said, Craig, it's all right. We'll do them later on. There is something else happening later this year you wanted to do with George.
Yes.
In Hollywood. Yeah.
Well, George, before he passed, he was selected, after being turned down twice, to receive his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And it's a pretty, I think it's a great honor. And a lot of people were concerned if George would still be able to receive that star now that he's passed away. And in fact, there are rules with the Hollywood Chamber on receiving your star if you are deceased. And those rules are, if you are deceased, you have to wait 5 years after you have passed in order to receive a star. However, since George was selected before he passed, he was already approved and selected by the committee, he is going to receive his star later on this year. And which is beautiful news to everyone involved who helped raise money for that. We're still going to be raising money for that. We've raised the initial $30,000 for the star itself, which is what it takes. But then now there's all the other stuff that goes with it for the all the other activities throughout the day. This is Hollywood. It costs a lot to do anything, to rent anything. So we're going to be doing a crowdfunding campaign to come up with the completion funds. When we found out George was sick, we kind of stopped all of that because we didn't really know what we should continue to do. Should we continue to try to raise this money right now? I didn't know how the Hollywood Chamber was going to react if they knew that he was terminally ill. We just didn't know. So everything kind of stopped. And truthfully, that wasn't priority at the time. It was just George getting well. But now that we know everything is safe and secure and he's going to receive his star, and the date will be announced a little bit down the road, we're going to start a crowdfunding campaign in order to finish those completion funds. And I think there's some great benefits for people who do want to participate, that will allow them to actually be at his ceremony, both the actual star ceremony and the private reception afterwards. There's going to be some nice things, so people should be looking out for that.
Right. Okay.
And once we know the details, I'll share them with you, so you can share with your people, your followers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, just before we sign off, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to everybody who's subscribed to the channel. We're talking about the followers. I think I'm within 4 of 600 subscribers now to the YouTube channel, which is, I'm amazed and terribly grateful. Thank you very much indeed to everybody who's subscribed to the channel. Please do, if you haven't already, please subscribe. There's always interesting people to listen to or ask questions of. Yes, please carry on doing that. Next week, the theme of the show is going to be, and the reason why this is now 50 years that in my country, in the United Kingdom, since the partial legalization of male homosexuality. I still can't believe that I was actually alive when it was still a criminal offense to be gay. And a lot's happened in that time. So the theme of next week's show is gays in horror. This is also one of the reasons I'm doing this, is because I'm going to be on the 16th of August, the 16th of this month in London. We're going to be screening Hell Bent, as well as screening my short film, The Night Whispered, at the Nova Nights, and that's going to be at the Horse Hospital in London. There'll be more details of that coming out. So if you're in London, come along and join me. And I'm being interviewed by Billy Chainsaw as well. But next week is Gays in Horror. So hopefully some of you guys will come along and join me. Chris, thank you very much indeed for sharing stories of your lovely friend, and obviously condolences from everyone. Because he's obviously...
Thank you. Thank you. And just to say, the outpouring of love from people all around the world, in every country imaginable, has been absolutely beautiful. It's been touching not only to myself, but to George's family. It means a lot, and he touched a lot of people. He was a wonderful man. He was a gentle giant, as I've always called him. And he touched people in ways that just meant so much. And so thank you to everyone who who loved him and continues to love him, and the beautiful things that are still being written about him, and people are sending packages and letters. It's really beautiful. So thank you to everyone who has done that and continues to do so.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay, folks, I will see you next week. Some of you, this has been Chattering with Nicholas Vince. I've been talking with Chris Rowe about his friend George Romero. And as I say, hopefully see some of you next week. And I'm going to hit the button and stop broad.